Political strategist Joe Pienaar and Rachel Cunliffe, who is from the New Statesman and is coming live from the Liberal Democrat conference down in Bournemouth. And we're going to be streaming the show live on YouTube. You can watch as well as listen, and I hope join in. Send us a text, send me a tweet, join in the chat after the news with James Kitchen.
Thank you, John. Good evening. The Foreign Secretary's warned Russia that British jets are ready to confront Moscow's planes should they violate NATO skies. Yvette Coopers told the UN Security Council the Kremlin is risking a fight with the alliance after 3 jets were intercepted in Estonian airspace on Friday. But Russia's deputy ambassador to the UN, Dmitry Polyansky, says the aircraft stuck to the agreed route.
Our neighbours have now imagined that Russia is at fault for an incursion into Estonian airspace. As always, there is no proof except the Russophobic hysteria coming from Tallinn.
Russian drones were also shot down recently over Poland and Romania. Meanwhile, France is preparing to join Britain, Canada and Australia in recognising a Palestinian state at the UN General Assembly in New York. Yvette Coopers described the UK's decision as an historic and moral step, insisting it keeps the hope of a two-state solution alive. But the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu warns the move gives a huge reward to terrorism. The former US Middle East negotiator Aaron David Miller told Times Radio recognition is an unwelcome distraction.
It is a distraction, it seems to me, from the core issue, which is alleviating the suffering of Palestinian civilians in Gaza, freeing the hostages and ending the war. And I think it gives the two key parties whose support for 2 states would be elemental, foundational, Israel and the United States, justification and excuse to be driven to their corners and not to focus on the proverbial day after.
Nigel Farage says he would make massive cuts to welfare spending under plans to abolish indefinite leave to remain. The Reform UK leader announced his government would force all migrants holding permanent settled status to reapply for visas with tougher rules. Labour's Chief Secretary to the Treasury, James Murray, told Times Radio the plans appear to have fallen apart in moments.
They set out these plans, as I understand it, and the figures they were based on were pretty roundly withdrawn by the think tank, or at least qualified by the think tank who had initially put them in the public domain. So, this is real kind of back of the fag packet stuff from Reform. And frankly, people want credible answers that are promising made-up solutions which fall apart at the first interrogation.
6 charities have now dropped the Duchess of York as patron after she sent a gushing message to Jeffrey Epstein soon after publicly disowning him. Sarah Ferguson's spokesman says she emailed the convicted paedophile in 2011 because he was threatening to sue her. And the Chancellor says approving a second runway at Gatwick shows the government is backing builders, not blockers. It's estimated another 100,000 flights a year could take off from the West Sussex Airport by 2029 when its emergency strip is upgraded. Rachel Reeves says it's great news for travellers.
People going on holiday will have a greater choice of destinations. It will mean lower costs for a family holiday, and it will also mean more good jobs, paying decent wages through this injection of cash into our economy.
Local campaigners say they won't benefit from the estimated £1 billion annual economic boost. They're threatening a judicial review over climate and noise pollution. And for a news bulletin when you want it, search for the Times News Briefing on the Times Radio app.
Across the UK, on DAB, online and on your smart speaker.
John Pienaar on Times Radio Drive with Barclays Corporate Banking.
It's really good to have you with us here on Pienaar and Friends, an hour of good conversation in very good company, which tonight is the political strategist Joe Pienaar. Hi to you, Joe.
Hello.
Lovely to see you. And Rachel Cunliffe from the New Statesman joins us live down the line from Bournemouth at the Lib Dem Party conference. Hello to you, Rachel.
Hello.
How are you in sunny Bournemouth? It always is sunny in Bournemouth, isn't it?
It is really sunny. You've had people just taking a break from the conference to go for a walk along the beach all day. It's been absolutely wonderful.
Yeah.
What's it like in Westminster?
Yeah, some really good fish and chips down there too. Joe, I want to come to you first.
I was just going to say it's not a massive vote of confidence for what's going on at the conference. Everyone's disappeared off to go to the beach, is it? But never mind. I mean,
everyone needs a break.
Very true.
Even at the most intense party conference, everyone needs a break.
There you go. Joe, what's your thought for the day?
So my thought for the day, John, was just something that I think is essentially are we going to see, I suppose it's a question I'm posing, the cyber attack at the weekend on Heathrow, and we saw these various airports actually taken out. We had Jaguar Land Rover recently. I remember a year ago talking on this show about the blood bank, the companies that were involved in supplying the NHS, because they had a cyber attack. There were concerns they had to cancel a load of operations. We had M&S, we had the Co-op, and it's just struck me that we're getting into, modern day warfare is very different. And actually it's, we've got a government that are moving very much. We've actually got a culture now, a sort of general talk about moving towards AI and using tech more. And it just struck me that we used to talk a lot about, worried about grandma getting scammed and clicking on some link somewhere and, getting caught in something that perhaps was gonna be sort of taking her information or causing a problem for systems. And it struck me that actually it's getting so much more sophisticated now. Are we going to see, or should we be calling more for, the government to be doing more around education to, talk about the next generations, but also more generally about the dangers of actually our lives online now? But also, are we going to see some moves to protect some of our critical national infrastructure, because it seems that these attacks are all over the place these days. So it's sort of everything from a basic consumer can be affected in their lives, but these big companies that are pretty sophisticated firms are actually getting knocked over by what on the face of it appear to be relatively simple attacks, but they're very, very good at what they're doing. So it just struck me that, while we talk about the advancements of tech and we herald it, we're actually incredibly and increasingly more and more vulnerable.
Yeah, I mean, it is such a profound worry, and all of us have got the experience of being attempted scammed. I don't know how many times in a week, never mind in a month or a year. But it is also true, Joe, isn't it, that there's a quite a large industry that devoted to the business of cybersecurity. We've got a national cybersecurity network, an organisation whose job it is to keep that information up to date.
And yet we can't get the planes running because they managed to take out an airport.
No, but it's a constant
it's a big
race against the scammers and hackers and all the rest of it. Anyway, what's your thought from down there in sunny Bournemouth, Joe? Rachel.
It's a Lib Dem thought, predictably, but I've been wandering around this conference trying to work out who the Lib Dems see as their main political opponents, political rivals, because you look at it one way and Labour, when they're losing votes, when they're losing support on their left, those votes are going to the Greens, possibly to the new Corbyn party, but to the Lib Dems. We know that sort of people who are frustrated with Labour for not being left-wing enough are shifting to the Lib Dems. On the Conservative side, basically all of the seats, the gains that they won at the last election were from the Tories, and actually there are another 20 seats where the Lib Dems came second and the Tories came first, so that would be a very obvious electoral path for them. But the chatter here has all been about reform. It's been about how the Lib Dems can provide a really robust counter-narrative and stave off what Nigel Farage is doing. I think that's really interesting because the Lib Dems aren't really expecting to lose voters to reform in the same way that Labour and the Tories are. Geographically, the areas they're going after are quite different, but the framing of this conference is Ed Davey the champion to see off Nigel Farage? I think it's fascinating.
It is fascinating. And in those conversations, in as far as it's possible to make a distinction, Rachel, are the Lib Dems you're talking to there worried that they're losing the argument with Nigel Farage and his Reform UK party and plans like the ones we saw set out today, or are they losing the argument with voters? Because they're not necessarily the same thing. It may mean that Reform are plugging into what's going on in the minds of many people just better than others.
Yeah, I think the main thing that they're worried about is just losing the argument to anyone by not getting the attention that they feel that they deserve or are entitled to, or just they're not being talked about as much as Farage is. So that is definitely a key priority when you talk to activists or strategists or just normal members. They kind of go, people should be paying more attention to us. What do we have to do to make that happen? But there is also a kind of counter-narrative that goes, the Conservatives are scared to really sort of lay into Nigel Farage for some of the stuff that he's saying because they don't want to put off the people who are potentially choosing between Reform and the Conservatives. Labour don't seem to be making that case either, at least not as robustly as they could be. The response to the Unite the Kingdom demonstrations last weekend being a really good example of that. Maybe the Lib Dems, as a party that doesn't feel directly threatened by what Farage are offering, are in a better position to be bold enough to bring that counter-punching. But maybe that's just me reading too much into it, and they're talking about Farage and Reform because that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, for sure. Look, and reading too much into things is what we do in this hour quite a lot of the time. Do the people you're talking to have an answer to all of this? If they're going to punch back, maybe not try and punch harder the way the Tories do on occasion, or for that matter, punch hard in a different way the way Labour does from time to time. What's the Lib Dem way?
I think at the moment it's to make as many comparisons between Nigel Farage and Donald Trump as they possibly can.
Yeah.
That's the Lib Dem way.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the last poll I saw said that some 16% of people have got a favourable opinion of Donald Trump. So in that sense, if you go there and people buy that and swallow that completely, then you are maybe preaching to the converted, but maybe that'll work for you. Anyway,
it's tough though, isn't it, as a political party to kind of just complain that you should get attention. That the problem has been that the Lib Dems got attention during the election campaign. Because it's all about who you give. Do you achieve balance? And even when balance was available during an election, Ed Davey felt the need to do something wild and wacky just to sort of use that attention he was given and make wacky. The challenge for the Lib Dems, which I think actually all parties are noticing now, is you have to say something in order to get a debate going. And the problem is plenty of people aren't keen on what Farage is saying, but he's at least saying something to get a conversation happening afterwards. Yeah. And the problem is even the government, when they've got something to announce, don't necessarily get the traction they want, which makes it doubly hard for the likes of the Lib Dems because they'll just be floating ideas, but they won't have particularly much excitement or sort of oomph behind them in the same way that Nigel's managing to do with Reform. Yeah,
I think I want to come back to Reform in a short while because, of course, we have their latest migration set of announcements. They've been large chunks have been bitten out of the numbers and the assumptions in that plan, but I want to talk about that in a minute. But before that, I want to talk about the Palestinian recognition issue, because that's going on as we speak at the UN in New York. We got Joe Tanner here, we got Rachel Cunliffe down there in Bournemouth at the Lib Dem conference. You're there. Do send me a text, send me a tweet, and let's all talk here on Pienaar and Friends with Barclays Corporate Banking. See you tomorrow, clearly, with Big Picture Banking from Barclays.
Nobody asks to have a lifetime of memories.
Radio Drive with Barclays Corporate Banking. Realize your business ambitions with Big Picture Banking from Barclays. Find out more at barclayscorporate.com/thetimes.
So, as I say, as I speak, at the UN, they're sort of gearing up for a solid discussion about the recognition of Palestine as a state. More countries joining the list of those who are doing that. Britain, of course, we know. France is getting ready to do that. Not all European countries are doing that. Germany and Italy are, well, they like the idea, but not yet. But the number of those countries going with recognition of Palestine at the UN, it's the great majority of the countries there. But what good will it do? What change will it make? I spoke earlier to the former Middle East negotiator for the US State Department, Aaron David Miller. He said this.
The missing ingredient, John, is leadership. There is none in Israel. There is none among the Palestinians, and there is none in Washington. So even if you gave Tony Blair the benefit of the doubt that this was the greatest, wisest, most extraordinary plan in human history, the benefit of the doubt, you need the horses to pull the wagon. Okay. And where are they?
So no leadership to make a difference. And yeah, there was a Tony Blair plan for the day after conflict in Gaza that moves towards eventually some sort of the Palestinian Authority re-elected, becoming a government in Palestine. There's just no movement in that direction. And I spoke to the former foreign correspondent Tim Marshall. He argued that Saudi Arabia was the country that ultimately held the key to rebuilding Gaza as and when the war ended.
It's important that countries are saying they recognise Palestine as a state, even if it has no concrete forward motion on it. But it's the Saudis that are the key to the rebuilding of Gaza towards putting in a form of Palestinian government that does not involve Hamas, because the Saudi leadership loathes Hamas. So I'll be watching the French-Saudi meeting this afternoon with more interest to see if something can come out of that.
Tim Marshall talking to me earlier on. Well, then I also spoke to a former British ambassador in the Middle East. That was Nicholas Hopton from RUSI. He warned that recognition of a Palestinian state could see Israel strike back.
My worry, actually, is that we may see some retaliation from Prime Minister Netanyahu, which he has promised for these recognitions this week, when he returns to Israel after his visit to New York and the General Assembly. He may well announce or push for a full annexation of the West Bank.
Yes.
This seems to be one of the options on the table. Yeah. Now, if he does that, in fact, the possibilities of further normalization and building stabilization across the region with the Gulf states such as Saudi Arabia may be put into greater jeopardy, in fact.
So another thing to be concerned about. Nicholas Hopton there. Rachel Cunliffe down in Bournemouth. Tell me, what's your overall take on the move towards more countries recognising Palestine, the value or otherwise of that?
Well, I was struck by the comments of the government's Middle East Minister, Hamish Falconer, who said earlier today that recognition, he called it the best route to peace, the best route to a ceasefire, and the best route to the release of all the hostages. I've been looking into it. I struggle to see where his argument for those things comes from, which is not to say that it's something that the British government shouldn't have done, and there is value in diplomacy and certainly in moving as a bloc with Canada, Australia, Portugal and France, the other countries that are moving towards recognition today. But as you heard there, this is highly unlikely to change the mind of the Israeli government, of Benjamin Netanyahu, to go, yes, now all these countries have recognised Palestine, that means we will act differently. In fact, if anything, it will make them more determined to be as aggressive as possible because they feel like the rest of the world has turned against them. And in terms of the best route to releasing all the hostages, well, firstly, you had the hostage families over the weekend expressing how distressed and how worried they were. But even without that, without placing any conditions on Hamas, which the UK government didn't do, the message that this essentially sends to them is terrorism works if you wait long enough. Now, obviously, Hamas that is not the view of the majority of the Palestinian people, but it's very difficult to see how recognition can help achieve peace and security when the two main sides in this conflict are not going to view it that way and are really probably not paying that much attention to, frankly, what the UK government or other European governments do anyway.
Right, so you lean towards the sort of counterproductive and certainly performative analysis of what's going on now. What about you, Jay?
I think it's a risky move, and I think we certainly won't know what it's going to do. We won't know the implications of it yet. But I think the thing is, we all have to hope that those involved in making this decision know something that we don't, or have some inclination that this is going to achieve something that we all can't see on the face of it, because it's an incredibly risky move if it does cause some sort of significant response on behalf of the Israelis, or even if it does make negotiation harder. So, you know, I agree. I listened to Hamish Faulkner this morning, and sort of I did think, you know, on the face of it, when you look at the idea that there's an active discussion going on, but that other people outside of that discussion are making a significant move, which could be seen as affecting one side of that, you do wonder if it's going to have the desired effect. If it's about bringing about peace, is it going to, or is it just going to destabilise those conversations? So, I think we all have to just sit and wait and hope for the best. But it's a pretty uncomfortable way to be viewing this.
Yeah, indeed. I'm gonna move on, because that's a fairly good point to jump off for the moment. Now, I promised earlier on we're going to talk about reform, because we looked at reform with Rachel down there in Bournemouth. Look at reform through a Liberal Democrat lens. Let's look at it now through our own lens, because we had that another chunk of headline-making policy from Nigel Farage and his party a bit earlier on. They say they want to get rid of settled status. Non-citizens, including those already living in the UK, would have to apply for a renewable 5-year visa. No more settled status, and that would come with a higher salary threshold as well, so harder to get that permission. At that news conference, Farage announced that only British citizens would be allowed to claim welfare.
Far too many that have come don't work, have never worked, and never will work. The ability to bring dependents of all kinds, and when you realise that most that come are very low skilled and on very low wages, you start to get a very, very different picture. In fact, you start to get a massive benefits bill. So I want to be absolutely clear at the outset that we are here to make massive future cuts to welfare spending.
Nigel Farage and the aforementioned Foreign Office Minister Hamish Faulkner, he said that reform's plans weren't serious.
This sounds to me like another reform policy proposal on the back of a fag packet. We've set out what we are doing to bring down illegal immigration in the white paper. We are looking at extending the period before which you can claim indefinite leave to remain from 5 years to 10. We have already removed 35,000 people who did not have the right to be here. We are bringing down foreign claimants to the immigrant system since July. We are taking serious steps to tackle this problem. Reform, once again, are coming out with unthought-through policy.
Right, so that's Hamish Faulkner. Our listener Phil in Devon writes in, reform's policy, he says, is economically illiterate and cretinous. Not that you three will challenge its utter stupidity. Well, I beg to differ with you there, Phil. I mean, you choose your own adjectives, but a certain amount of challenging does and will go on. Joe, what did you make of what you heard from Nigel Farage?
It was classic Farage, as we've sort of come to expect. It was, on the face of it, well orchestrated, because, you know, there was an opinion piece, there was the setting out of the pre-briefing of the speech, and then obviously the speech itself, and then of course it actually started to unravel a bit. And questions over the figures that were being used, because the figures that were quoted, that even the organisation that produced the report for the figures to be used distanced themselves from those numbers. And again, a sort of Nigel's gone in one direction and Zia's gone in a sort of other direction, and this sort of slight Zia is in charge of policy as the new sort of role he's been given within the party, and yet again a sort of discrepancy and some distance between the two of them about where they actually are. So the standard criticism of, you know, how much is this going to cost, how exactly is it going to be managed, how is it going to be worked, remain, but then also just the basics of not everyone's on the same bus, you know, on this. Even as a party, even though they look like they're getting their mechanics together, there then are these problems with how they're announcing stuff. And it goes back to that. The headlines look great, but actually in terms of they're getting attention.
Yes.
But then the devil in the detail, you don't even have to dig in that hard to see that the thing is just not robust at all.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
you know, I think that remains one of the biggest challenges for reform, that even though they are talking and looking like they're professionalising themselves, they still have got some massive hurdles to jump.
Yeah. I mean, grabbing the spotlight is an achievement in politics. Getting attention is an achievement in politics. But once you've got it, you've got to look the part in the spotlight. I mean, your policies and your plans and your numbers you use to back them up have got to add up and make sense.
And on something really controversial where you know you're going to get a load of flack from lots of different people, you've got, you know, I've seen numerous stories from people today talking about people they know, people that are scared, people that don't know what this is going to mean, you know, as a potential deterrent for people to coming into the UK. You know, if that's Nigel Farage's sort of first kind of goal of this, well, great, you've got the headlines and people are going to be slightly alarmed about what it means. But there is still another side to this whole challenge, and it sort of echoes a bit with what's been said about in America as well, about, you know, people's positioning and people's ability to live and work. You know, the reality is business in particular doesn't desperately want to go and find people to work from other places. It doesn't want to have to pay to bring people into the UK. It wants to have a skilled workforce here.
Yeah.
And in plenty of industries and in some of our public services, there simply aren't the people to do it. So actually, some people that come here and end up obtaining leave to remain are very valuable to our economy. And you can't run away from
Let's
that.
take the social care sector, which is a good example of this. This is a part of the economy which has, as we stand, 130,000 vacancies. And here we're talking about a policy which sets out, we're told, by Nigel Farage and his colleagues, to replace those workers with British replacements. Look, nothing wrong with the idea of getting more Brits into more British jobs, and in that way bringing down the draw on foreign labour coming into this country. But 130,000 vacancies now. And that's they're clearly.
And how big's the workforce that you're going to decimate?
Do those jobs at those wages? And when Nigel Farage says, "Fine, pay them more," well, yeah, great. Just get the companies to do that. Make that
and
work.
Find the money in the NHS to do that.
Yeah.
You know, and at the end of the day, the money is one thing, but the job is also another part of it. And you know, we have people that are growing up and that want to do incredible things. We've got people with great ambition. There are still a finite number of jobs in any sector, in any place that you want to work.
Yeah.
There are also going to be jobs that are less appealing. It's always going to be a challenge.
Rachel, tell me your thoughts.
So I agree in the importance of flagging how unworkable this is, on the potential for legal challenges, on the impact on business and on social care. But I also just want to stop and just take a moment to acknowledge how extreme a policy this is, because this is not saying if you came here illegally we will send you back, which is something that Reform have already said. It's not saying we want to extend how long you have to be in this country before you have the right to claim indefinite leave to remain, which is something that both Labour and the Conservatives have said they're looking into. It is saying if you came here legally on a valid visa that the UK government granted you and you followed all the rules and you have been living and working here for years, maybe you're married to somebody, maybe you've got a career here, maybe you've got a house here, you are contributing to the economy, we can retroactively change the rules, take away your settled status, and if you're not earning enough money, deport you. That is really extreme, and that is a significant departure from the debate around illegal migration and people who come here on small boats. And we should be, I think, honest about how extreme that is and how much outside of the mainstream opinion that Reform have gone with this.
Yeah, I mean,
it's really radical, and it's really unsettling as well.
And I think that's where, you know, as I said earlier, I've read stories today of people talking about people in their lives that they, you know and that are scared by this as a concept. And it just, I mean, it feels inherently un-British to me. It feels really odd. There are so many moments in history where we actually relied on people that came from other countries and that built a life here, and it does seem, it doesn't feel, for me, it certainly doesn't, it's not something I feel very comfortable about at all. And I don't know whether this is part of reform strategies to kind of get the attention with something much more radical that then they know over the next few years they're going to have to get to a different place with actually what they bring in. And don't they look reasonable after all because they haven't gone with the extreme end? Or is it that they're actually going to pursue the more extreme end? And, you know, I feel that this is something where, again, because we know there are holes in it, do we take it that seriously this far out from an election with so much more work to do on its policy agenda? Or do we genuinely, you know, see this as something that is a real contender of a policy? And it actually, really, to Rachel's point, is it so extreme that it could even put people off?
And we saw a few weeks ago when Nigel Farage set up the plans for unlawful migration. This was about lawful migration, but unlawful migration. The party changed its position really quite significantly overnight, in the space of a few hours after the reaction to the idea of kicking out women and children as part of this mass roundup of Channel and other migrants. I mean, how will this policy react? You know, how will it bear the weight of public scrutiny? And we'll be waiting for some opinion polls on that, I think, really quite keenly. Okay, after the news, we're going to look at what's going on in America. As I speak, Caroline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, speaking. We'll watch that for anything that you'll need to know about. And we're going to be talking about the political war, about free speech and so many other things going on over the other side of the Atlantic. This is Pienaar and Friends on Times Radio, now at 6:32, the news with James Kitchen.
Across the UK, on DAB, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio.
Thank you, John. Good evening. Britain's warned Russia its actions above the skies of Estonia, Romania and Poland risk triggering an armed conflict. Moscow's denied or downplayed violating NATO airspace in recent weeks. The Foreign Secretary, Yvette Cooper, is urging Israel not to expand its settlements in the West Bank following the UK's decision to recognise the state of Palestine. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu warns it's a reward for terrorism. Australia, Canada and Portugal joined Britain's decision yesterday. France is preparing to announce recognition at the UN General Assembly later. In London, the Palestinian ambassador, Hassan Zomlot, raised the flag outside its new embassy.
And it is an acknowledgement of a historic injustice. Ladies and gentlemen, Palestine exists. It has always existed, and it always will.
Meanwhile, Donald Trump is to hold talks with the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky at the UN tomorrow. Nigel Farage says he would make massive cuts to welfare spending under plans to abolish indefinite leave to remain. The Reform UK leader announced his government would force all migrants holding permanent settled status to reapply for visas with tougher rules. And 6 charities have now dropped the Duchess of York's patron after she sent a gushing message to Jeffrey Epstein soon after publicly disowning him. Sarah Ferguson's spokesman says she emailed the convicted paedophile in 2011 because he was threatening to sue her. And for a news bulletin when you want it, search for the Times News Briefing on any podcast platform.
This is Times Radio.
Radio app or wherever you get your podcasts.
Times Radio Drive with Barclays Corporate Banking. Expand your business horizons with big picture banking from Barclays. Find out more at barclayscorporate.com/thetimes.
I'm John Pienaar with Pienaar and Friends, with Rachel Cunliffe from the New Statesman down at the Lib Dem conference in Bournemouth. Joe Tanner, political strategist, here with me in the studio, and we have been joined here by Kate, who takes over at 7. Hello, Kate.
Hiya, John. So this evening at around 9 o'clock, Yvette Cooper will make her formal declaration to the United Nations that the UK is recognising the state of Palestine. Others will follow suit, of course. Canada, Australia, soon to be France, Belgium and others. The Germans still cannot be shifted. We gather that Italy is softening a little to the idea. So a big watch on that tonight. And we'll also be covering to a letter sent to the Times overnight by some pretty serious names. Sir Grant Shapps, the former Defence Secretary, Air Vice Marshal Philip Lester, Colonel Richard Kemp, Major Andrew Fox and Rear Admiral Chris Parry, who we'll be speaking to this evening, who basically say that if the UK fall out with Israel, if that is the result of officially recognising Palestinians, a Palestinian state, then our national security will be compromised. They say it is reckless in the extreme to follow through with the policy. I mean, one might say they're a little bit late to make this plea. But they say, look, our nations work together shoulder to shoulder in countering the likes of Iran and Islamist extremism. Israel's intelligence services have helped thwart devastating terror attacks here in the UK. The British Army routinely uses Israeli-made surveillance drones and battlefield medical equipment. So I guess the point is here, there is widespread condemnation in this country for the manner in which the Israeli government has executed their assault on Gaza. And as much as we should be taking action against that, what many of these serious former defence officials and former armed forces officials say is that we need to be a little bit careful about falling out with Israel for matters of our own national security. I thought it's a good point of view, so we'll be taking a look at that tonight. There's also been lots from Yvette Cooper at the UN Security Council today. She has said that if the UK needs to confront planes operating in NATO airspace without permission, she will. She says Vladimir Putin risks armed confrontation with NATO. She's speaking, of course, after that latest incursion of NATO airspace by Russian military planes in Estonia over the weekends. There's been lots of conversations at the UN Security Council about NATO airspace today. So we'll get the latest on that and take a little look at what else we'll hear this evening. Something a bit different, John, for you tonight. There's a story, I can't reveal it yet. It'll be going up on the Times a little bit later on. But it's about super fans naming their children with a nod to what they are super fans of. I can't give too much more detail apart from to say that some of these names are, quite frankly, ridiculous. And that's going to lead me to ask the question, do you know anyone named after someone famous or, someone's parents who are a fan of something in particular? Humphrey Bogart,
there used to be a big trend in footballers, didn't there, where people would give their kids the sort of full name of a footballer, which was always a bit wacky.
Well,
but
at least one example, someone naming their son the entire lineup of Liverpool Football Club. Remember that?
I think I do remember that. I remember being pregnant, and I was pregnant during Boris's 2008 mayoral campaign, and I remember I was going off on maternity leave, and he did phone me and said, Boris is a really good name for a boy.
Did he?
And I knew I was having a boy, and the problem was my favoured name was actually Alexander, which is Boris's real name,
right?
So then I was like, well, I can't use that either, so I didn't use either in the end.
So why didn't you use Alexander? Had you sort of fallen out with your boss by then, Joe?
No, but having worked for Boris and then announcing that I was pregnant during that campaign, you can imagine lots of people wondering what his hair colour was going to be when he was born.
No,
and I was like, I'm not going down that road of even naming my child with the same name as him, just in case I get that extra stick.
Keir
So I didn't do
Starmer,
it.
named after Keir Hardie, isn't he? If you're talking about celebrity pass-ons, there's also some great sort of animal naming after super. I can't say what these people are super fans of, but they've got ridiculously named animals as well. We've started to name the plants in my house. I bought a new plant. Me and my son have called it Jeffrey Bezos. And every evening, Jeffrey...
So you gave it as it were...
Yes.
Oh, really?
We started to name our plants.
For when you talk to your plants, because you need a name, don't you, obviously?
The thing about Jeffrey Bezos is every evening he raises his leaves to the heavens and shows us his purple underside. So Bezos gives us a little flash of his purple
We're not
belly.
even past the watershed.
Yeah.
Just be talking about Jeffrey's
I can
underside.
hear Rachel down in Bournemouth. Rachel in Bournemouth is loving this.
Surreal.
Yeah, do you know any people who've named their kids bizarre things?
So in my friend's NCT group, there were 2 Khaleesi's, which comes from Game of Thrones.
Oh my goodness!
So I don't know if that's the fan group that Kate's talking about there, but
No,
I
it
think
isn't.
Khaleesi has now not Daenerys, who is the actual name of the character. It means queen.
Yeah, it means queen.
But the Game of Thrones names have now gone so mainstream that there were 2 in one baby group.
Right. I wonder how many Tyrions there are out there. And
There was a big, wasn't there a big surge in like people naming their cats Simba after The Lion King came out? and stuff?
Probably.
I sort of remember hearing Simba a lot seem to appear, but yeah, I don't know. And I think there were also, what was the gremlin that people used to call their a lot of cats were called like Gizmo after Gizmo in the Gremlin film
well,
like years
for
ago.
giving your cat a silly name.
I know, but then you've got to be, what about that guy who sort of shouted Fenton at his dog that went off at Richmond Park that changed the deer? Like, you've got to remember at some point you might stand outside your door and shout this name, which may be even worse if you have to shout at one of your children in public, but, imagine shouting at your dog or your cat.
Rachel.
Doesn't Lindsay Hoyle have loads of pets and then name all of them after politicians? He's got like a Margaret Thatcher parrot, I think, but he's got sort of countless cats and dogs, and they've all got political names.
Wow.
Which I think
that sounds like Lindsay.
Gives you an insight into life in the Hoyle household.
Yes.
It does, doesn't it?
You can imagine him
It's
sitting there
just
at
an
home
excuse to
his
shout at
parrot.
Margaret Thatcher every evening, isn't it?
Hey, Margaret, order, Margaret. Okay. All right, looking forward to the show. 7 o'clock right after this one. Now, I said we're going to cross the Atlantic. Let's cross the Atlantic because look, we're watching the UN in the process now of various countries joining the list of those recognising Palestine as a state. Tomorrow, Donald Trump will be talking at the UN, and Caroline Levitt, his press secretary, as we've been speaking, has been speaking at the White House press briefing, giving, I think, a bit of an insight into what's coming tomorrow from President Trump.
Tomorrow morning, President Trump will deliver a major speech touting the renewal of American strength around the world, his historic accomplishments in just 8 months, including the ending of 7 global wars and conflicts. The president will also touch upon how globalist institutions have significantly decayed the world order, and he will articulate his straightforward and constructive vision for the world. The president will also be hosting bilateral meetings with the UN Secretary General and the leaders of Ukraine, Argentina, and the European Union. The president will also later in the day hold a multilateral meeting with Qatar, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, Turkey, Pakistan, Egypt, the UAE, and Jordan.
Right. Well, Caroline was also asked about the president's reaction to those nations recognising a Palestinian state.
As for all of these Western nations that are recognizing a Palestinian state, the president has been very clear. He disagrees with this decision. He spoke about that in the UK, standing right next to his friend, Prime Minister Starmer. And he feels this does not do anything to release the hostages, which is the primary goal right now in Gaza, does nothing to end this conflict and bring this war to a close. And frankly, he believes it's a reward to Hamas. So he believes these decisions are just more talk and not enough action from some of our friends and allies, and I think you'll hear him talk about that tomorrow at the UN.
Right, okay. Lara Spirit's on the line, Times Washington correspondent. Great to have you here, Lara.
Hi, John.
Hi. So we're listening to that, first of all. What do you think? It sounds like getting ready for Donald Trump to turn up at the UN and give the UN what for?
Yeah, well, it's very interesting because in recent weeks, although Levitt is right that Trump had registered his disapproval of those Western leaders who were pushing to recognise Palestinian statehood, he has nonetheless left largely this fight to Marco Rubio to make that clear, especially to US diplomats who, it's been reported, have been kind of lobbying some countries around the world against participating in that French-Saudi conference at the UN. Now, although that's not had much success. It's clear that Rubio has been one of the key figures in this. Now, of course, we have Levitt saying again that Trump is really resolutely opposed to this, using the language of it being a reward to Hamas. I think one of the things that Western leaders, particularly Keir Starmer, might take heart from, though, is that, Levitt referred there to Starmer as Trump's friend. And they're going to have to bank on the fact that, on the idea and the hope that even if this is something that the US administration is resolutely opposed to, that it might not cause any sort of major diplomatic fallout with any of these Western countries, and that obviously remains to be seen.
Okay, and what about him referring to the problem of these globalist institutions? We're talking about, it's not an unfamiliar theme, because the Trump administration doesn't have a lot of time for multinational institutions, and the UN may be high on the list.
Yeah, I mean, that would be really interesting to see what the specifics of that are. That was the line that jumped out at me from those comments from Caroline Levitt there, John. I think that in the US at the moment, obviously one of the big questions in the wake of Charlie Kirk's murder has been the so-called domestic terror movement that those in the White House are going after, mentioning big organizations at time like the Ford Foundation or George Soros' organizations. And I think we are entering a period where the administration is reflecting on the role of different organizations, particularly internationally, and how he references the UN tomorrow will be very interesting.
All right, Lara, it's really good to have you here. I want to move on in a moment then and talk about the argument that's really sort of boiling away in the United States about freedom of speech. On the one hand, you have the president. He was, accusing critics of his, I think at one point over the weekend, of the criticism being illegal. Didn't quite explain how he arrived at precisely that conclusion. But you also then have the Broadcasting Authority of the United States, headed by Brendan Carr, which is threatening TV companies, local TV companies, as well as networks, with losing their right to broadcast over criticism on those networks of the president. And as we're going to hear in just a moment, some on the right of American politics aren't happy about that at all either. Let's talk about that in a moment with Joe Tanner, with Rachel Cunliffe down in Bournemouth, and with Lara Spirit in Washington. I'm John Pienaar here on Times Radio with Barclays Corporate Banking. Change your perspective with Big Picture Banking from Barclays.
And sport every weekday in breakfast from 6:30 a.m.
John Pienaar on Times Radio.
And Joe Tanner here with me in the studio. Rachel Cunliffe down in Bournemouth with the Liberal Democrats, and Lara Spirit, the Washington correspondent for the Times. He's in DC. Lara, back to you, if I can. Just give us a bit more of an update on how this freedom of speech argument is going, because it does seem to be warming up, doesn't it? After the threats from the Federal Communications Commission, sort of Trump administration agencies, who pull the licenses of broadcasters who were airing views in different ways that the president seriously objected to, there were some on the conservative side of politics who were not happy about that. Just have a listen to Ted Cruz, the Texas Republican senator, speaking on his podcast, Verdict with Ted Cruz. He said this.
And so he threatens explicitly, we're going to cancel ABC's license. We're going to take them off the air so ABC cannot broadcast anymore. And I got to say, he threatens it. He says, we can do this the easy way, or we can do this the hard way.
Yeah.
And I got to say, that's right out of Goodfellas. That's right out of a mafioso coming into a bar going, nice bar you have here. It'd be a shame if something happened to it.
So Senator Cruz there, Lara, practicing his theatrical skills with that sort of mafiosi accent. But the thought was very, very serious, wasn't it? Comparing an agency of the administration to a mafia gang.
Yeah, I think it was a very significant intervention from Cruz there, and all eyes are on what the administration chooses to do in its fight against what Stephen Miller calls the domestic terror movement in the US among the so-called radical left. And as part of that, of course, we have had a week in which, as you say, the FCC has been flexing its muscles, Brendan Carr, and the big controversy around that has been somewhat polarizing among some circles. I think it's about to get more so. I mean, you do have at the moment, subtly competing worldviews about this question of free speech, particularly within the MAGA fold. You have, I was at the Charlie Kirk Memorial in Arizona this weekend, and Tulsi Gabbard, the Director of National Intelligence, was one of a number of cabinet secretaries who spoke at that, and she gave a very forthright defence of free speech, which of course many of those present will have said was a central tenet of Charlie Kirk's beliefs. They would argue that was one of the big things that he stood for. And of course, in recent weeks, among some in the MAGA fold, particularly around that whole controversy when Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, said that there was a difference between free speech and hate speech, and then clarified after that there wouldn't be any prosecutions for those on the basis of their speech unless it was, flagrantly illegal under those traditional terms. We have had a kind of slightly difficult and uncomfortable chapter for some in the MAGA fold around exactly where the parameters or boundaries of that speech is. And from Gabbard yesterday, we had a very, very significant defence of that, I think. And I think you'll see that in the coming days. At the same event, of course, we had Stephen Miller, who's the Deputy White House Chief of Staff, who spoke in very stark terms about his enemies. What he said was their enemies. He painted them as sort of wicked. He used a number of different words to describe them and said, they are basically nothing, declaring a significant war on political enemies, which I think the specifics of we haven't yet seen but are expected to see in the coming days.
Yeah, Joe Tanner and Rachel are listening to what you're saying. Joe?
There's a sort of, it's a worrying trend. I thought what was interesting is this move around controlling environments. Actually, even from Trump, it spread to the state banquet where he got on the plane afterwards and talked about how Sadiq Khan hadn't been allowed to go, the Mayor of London, which is a sort of, this sort of controlling where the discussion happens or how it happens or who might be seen to be some sort of objector to you is a very worrying sort of move. And I think what is fascinating and what is going to continue to be fascinating, and I say that while I'm on Times Radio, but there is a growing move as well towards people being able to self-broadcast, people being able to move into other environments to actually have conversations and find their own backers for that. And we've obviously seen some of those talk show hosts have talked about that in the States. And so this general move towards taking things away from where there is control is potentially where we're going to see more and more of the conversation, and actually potentially more and more viewers sort of moving away from the traditional mainstream environments where they would see political discussion, commentary going on. Yeah,
Rachel, tell us what's in your mind.
Couple of things. I think it's significant that there's been an intervention from Ted Cruz. I mean, he is really one of the few, I think the first really high-profile Republican I've seen making the obvious point that a government that lionises and champions free speech now seems to have very clear ideas of who that speech should be for, and if you're somebody who might be critical of the administration, then it's not for you. Now, obviously, Ted Cruz, not a natural ally, had never been a natural ally of Donald Trump. I remember the primary, the 2016 primary, and Lion Ted Cruz, that was Donald Trump's nickname for him when he was back into getting nicknames for everyone, and it's not like they're political allies, but Ted Cruz is very much of the right of American politics. So to have that intervention from him, I think, is significant. I think Joe's also absolutely right to flag the controlling environment point. It wasn't just Sadiq Khan at the state banquet; it was also an Australian journalist. Well, Trump was over in the UK for the state visit, asking a question that Trump didn't like, and his response to that was, "I'm going to be speaking to your prime minister about you. Basically, you're in trouble, mate." And that was for asking a perfectly legitimate question about, I think, Trump's business interests. So I think it's a positive development that we have finally recognised that much of the hand-wringing the right, the obsession they had with free speech really is based in hypocrisy, and when it is speech directed back at them that they don't like, they have a very different view of it. It's not a lefty woke snowflake issue, it's something that the right are very passionate about as well. I think what will be really interesting is to see are there further splits in the MAGA movement over this, and I don't expect to see them, because essentially for so long the rule has essentially been what Trump says goes, and if Trump says suddenly you can't have free speech if you're critical of me, we've seen American institutions just pretty much bend towards that at the slightest sign of any threat whatsoever. So I'm not hopeful.
Indeed. Well, before we wind up for tonight, I do want to get both of your thoughts, Joe and Rachel, on a story which really got my attention today. The news of water companies dumping sewage through emergency pipes that were never meant there for the purpose. Now, possibly facing the prospect of action, some would say, if that's proved deserved action by Ofwat and the Environment Agency. But Lara Spirit in Washington, really grateful to have you here, Lara. Last time we spoke, I asked you how you were getting on adjusting to life in Washington, and you said it was a bit of an adjustment. You've gone now very clearly from the frying pan into the furnace.
Yes, I think being in Arizona this weekend was completely fascinating. It was I guess my first significant reporting trip away from DC, and it was just so interesting to meet all the people that had gone to Glendale. Some of them queuing since the night before, some of them, traveling thousands of miles over multiple days to be there. And so I think a really interesting experience for a journalist to be able to talk to people like that who had sort of made, in their view, many of them a sort of pilgrimage to see that memorial yesterday.
Yeah. And so interesting to get your take on it with us back here. Do come back and talk to us again very soon, because we're going to be calling you again very soon. Lara Spirit there in Washington. So lastly then, just a thought from Joe and you, Rachel, on this story in the Times today. The water companies, 10 water companies dumping sewage, pretty much raw sewage in volume through these pipes that were only there for emergency use, not for that use. Well, it's all come out, and now it's being investigated, and there could well be action. I spoke to Adam Vaughan, Times Environment editor, who told us about this.
These ones that I've been writing about are part of a network of about 7,000 emergency pipes. These are called emergency overflows. They're largely unmonitored, and these are not out on the wider sewer network. They're all at next to pumping stations, and as the name suggests, they're meant to be only used in emergencies. So, for example, if there's a mechanical failure and the alternative is raw sewage pumping up into homes and businesses, then this will be used. Ofwat, the regulator, thinks from the very limited data it has that these should be used about once a year at most, compared to about 20 times a year for the more sort of conventional types of relief valves on the networks, which are called storm overflows. So there's two sets of things. We talk about storm overflows a lot. That's what we normally talk about. But we're talking about this new thing, emergency overflows.
Adam Vaughan there talking to me a bit earlier on. Rachel Cunliffe down there with the Liberal Democrats in Bournemouth. It's the sort of thing guaranteed to get people fuming at a Liberal Democrat conference, but not just there.
No, it's a very Lib Dem coded issue, sure, but I think everyone will be horrified and disgusted to hear that. And the big question is, what is the point of having a regulator if the regulator isn't able to track when this is happening and isn't able to enforce it and stop companies from doing it? What is the point of them?
Yeah, and it does get people steamed up, Joe. And we remember after the last general election here, over and over again we heard this was a thing that came up again and again on the doorsteps.
And it's quite astonishing to hear that these pipes are right by pumping stations. They're not in the middle of nowhere where you could justify them not being monitored, but it just seems bonkers that these are actually close to pumping stations where there should be some knowledge that this is even going on. So it's just another knock of Ofwat, probably very deservedly.
All right, Joe Tanner, Rachel Cunliffe, thanks so much for being with me today. Thank you for listening. Emily Leahy was our producer. Isaac Marley was the technical operator, and Kate's up next. This is Times Radio.
Across the UK, on DAB, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio, the voice of the Times.
Thanks, John. Have a great night. It is 7 o'clock. This is the Evening Edition with Kate Borsay. Coming up,
Russia's reckless